Martinsburg, West Virginia, a sleepy town tucked in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia with a population of 19,000. It's the 7th largest city in the state, and it's widely known as the gateway to the Shenandoah Valley. A once bustling town that catered to and centered around industries, Martinsburg saw a decline in the 90s, but has since seen a resurgence thanks to locals, tourism, and industries alike. Located on the outskirts of downtown Martinsburg sits a former railroad shop complex of one of the city's largest employers from decades gone by, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. To understand the significance of this shop complex, we must start where all historians start, at the beginning. The year is 1828, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad has just laid its first stone and begun construction of a railroad heading west from Montclair, Baltimore, with the ultimate goal of reaching the Ohio River Valley. 2 years in, and the B&O made it to the city of Ellicott Mills, constructing the first 13 miles of common carrier laid track in all of the U.S. Picks a swingin' and shovels a diggin'. 12 years later, in the summer of 1842, the B&O reached Martinsburg, West Virginia, and literally set up shop. Roughly 100 railroad miles west of Montclair, Baltimore, the railroad was in need of a maintenance and repair facility for its growing fleet of steam locomotives and rolling stock. Martinsburg would become that place as the track-laying crews continued to push west onto Cumberland, Maryland, and beyond. To quote the May 26, 1842 edition of the Martinsburg Gazette,
"She's coming! She's coming! Whoop! Here she comes! Did you hear the whistle? Woo-wee! How she squeals!" These and 1,000 other merry, joyful, ludicrous exclamations, accompanied with more shouts and huzzahs than we've heard since the log cabin days, marked the arrival of the first steam engine in Martinsburg on Saturday last.
So now that we've reached Martinsburg with the B&O track crew, we'll let them push on and lay rail up to Cumberland. But in the meantime, let's focus on the physical site itself. Beginning in 1848, the railroad began building up the site with a rectangular engine house, as well as the 5-story brick station across the tracks that doubled as a hotel. 4 years later, in 1852, the railroad built a machine shop in addition to a roundhouse. The cannon fire that ripped into Fort Sumter in April of 1861 would signal the beginning of the bloody 4-year war between the states. 2 months later, on June 20th, 1861, Confederate General Thomas Jackson, who would later earn the prolific nickname of Stonewall, arrived with his troops in the railroad town of Martinsburg. Jackson's troops would lay complete siege to the shop complex and surrounding railroad infrastructure. But I think we'll let President John Work Garrett of the B&O speak about this as he addresses the directors and stockholders in the 37th Annual Company Report.
Great destruction of company's property at Martinsburg. The polygonal engine house, the half-round engine house, the large and costly machine shops, warehouse, ticket and telegraph offices, the company's hotel and dining and wash house, master mechanic's house, coal bin, sand houses, blacksmith shop, and tool houses. The pumping engine for the water station and the connecting pipes were all destroyed.
Wow. Complete annihilation of the B&O's Pride and Joy shop complex. But we'll let President Garrett go on and tell us more about the destruction of the track, the infrastructure, and the roadbed, both east and west of the Martinsburg shop complex.
Destruction of tracks also commenced and continued until the main track from near the 87th to the 108.5 mile, and the second track from Martinsburg to 108.5 mile, and all the sidings and switches and Duffields, Kearneysville, Vanclarsville, Martinsburg, and other points destroyed, making a total of 37.5 miles of track. The cross ties from which were burned to heat and bend the iron.
Ah yes, cross ties which were burned to heat and bend the iron. President Garrett is alluding to what would famously become known as Sherman's bow ties, where sections of rail were heated to cherry red and wrapped around trees and telegraph poles, rendering them completely useless. April of 1865 would finally see the end of the bloody war between the states, and would also see the B&O rebuild the Martinsburg shop in the following year. In 1866, the railroad would build the West Roundhouse, machine shop, a woodworking shop, and a car shop to replace what Stonewall Jackson had completely obliterated. Adding to the complex in 1872, the railroad then built the East Roundhouse, thus completing the modern shop complex as visitors see it today. Repairs to steam locomotives, passenger cars, and other rolling stock would return in these post-Civil War years, bringing the sounds of progress back to Martinsburg. In post-Civil War years, better known to historians as Reconstruction, the U.S. economy was driven mostly by railroads and agriculture. Host to boom time, multiple railroads would begin laying track and revitalizing what had been worn out or destroyed during the Civil War. But eventually all bubbles do burst, and the railroads were no different. Jay Cooke, president of the Great Northern Railroad, would challenge the 1869 completed Transcontinental Railroad with a second attempt of tracks heading to the West Coast. This and other massive capital expenditures would help trigger the Panic of 1873. So here we meet our old friend John W. Garrett again. The Panic of 1873 would set into motion an economic depression and rather stormy financial weather. Normally a strong economic engine, the B&O stock fell in the spring of 1877. All the while, Garrett would ask banks for another loan, while in the same breath cutting employee wages by 10%. Garrett would not be the only one to slash workers' wages, though. In late May of 1877, Pennsylvania Railroad's president, Tom Scott, would be the first to cut wages by 10% and was subsequently followed by a host of others, including the B&O. Pent-up aggression in conductors, engineers, firemen, and other trainmen at the initial 10% cut would act as kindling for the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The match that ignited the riots and protests would be struck by B&O leadership. Effective July 16, 1877, President Garrett and the B&O leadership would put into effect another 10% cut of wages on top of the previous 10% for any worker making more than $1 a day. Despite uproar from the firemen and brakemen, the two junior rolls and engine and train crews, the cut went into effect. On the morning of July 16th, locomotive firemen in Martinsburg climbed down from the calves of their iron steeds and refused to stoke the fires until the wage cut was reversed. Martinsburg town mayor, Mayor Schutt, and local police would have no parts of this and arrested the striking firemen. Quickly set free by local citizens, these locals also prevented other men from taking the place of those striking firemen on the idling steam engines. Increasing numbers of other trainmen joined the firemen to swell the ranks of the strikers to well into the hundreds. Across the tracks, the balcony and platform of the station hotel began filling with citizens and spectators alike. In the distance, the sounds of fife and drums filled the air as Berkeley's light infantry commanding officer, Colonel Faulkner, and his troops marched into the rail yard. Faulkner was intent on using strong force on the strikers, but Mayor Schutt would say differently.
Colonel, would it not be well to speak with the strikers and give them at least fair warning of what they may expect if they interfere with the engine or the train?
Standing proud upon the station platform, the colonel relaxed his stance upon contemplating using force on the strikers. Sources vary, but somewhere around 10 a.m. that morning, with old Colonel Faulkner and Mayor Schutt still on the station platform, a train, surrounded and guarded by Colonel Faulkner's troops, slowly crept towards the switch that would lead it out onto the main line. Sitting on the pilot of the locomotive, one of Faulkner's troops, John Poisel, noticed the switch was lined against the train. If not touched, the train would derail as the huffing and puffing steam engine crept closer. With musket in hand, Poisel leapt from the pilot or the cowcatcher and ran toward the switch. One of the striking firemen, one William Vandergrift, stood next to the switch as its guard.
Don't you throw that switch!
I'm not going to see the train run on a siding if I can prevent it,
exclaimed Poisel in return. Brandishing a small pistol from his belt, Vandergrift fired 2 shots. One grazing Poisel on the side of the head, and the other completely missing Poisel altogether. Along with a fellow soldier, Poisel fired on Vandergrift, striking and mortally wounding him. Shots rang out in scuffle, but Faulkner's troops were slowly overwhelmed by the strikers. As famed detective Alan Pinkerton wrote,
These few and simple circumstances were greatly magnified by the correspondents of Baltimore, Washington, and New York papers who visited the place in force, and by the time the small speck of news reached the West, it had grown by such prodigious proportions that the Martinsburg people who were witnesses of all the incidents could hardly recognize it.
From the morning of July 16th to the evening of Wednesday, July 18th, the strikers held fast and maintained control of the railroad's property and freight trains, while still allowing passenger trains through. But 3 days is all B&O President Garrett would tolerate, as he and West Virginia Governor Henry Matthews telegraphed the U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes to ask for federal intervention and troops. With the arrival of General W.H. French and his 200 heavily armed troops of the 4th U.S. Artillery, Martinsburg would return to normal with the ringleaders of the strikers rounded up and arrested. Just as in 1866, after Stonewall Jackson destroyed the site, the railroad town would once again return to business as usual. Granted, further riots and strikes would explode in the city of Baltimore and others on the eastern seaboard, but that's a different story for another time. The Martinsburg shop complex would soldier on to support the B&O for decades, until the merger of the B&O, C&O, and Western Maryland, better known as the Chessie system. The Chessie would close the East Roundhouse in 1985. As the Chessie system merged with the Seaboard Airlines, the emerging railroad, CSX, would close the West Roundhouse 3 years later in 1988. Sadly, juvenile arsonists would set fire to the East Roundhouse in 1990. The close of the 20th century would see CSX sell the dormant and forlorn shop complex to the Berkeley County Commission in 1999. The following year, the commission then transferred the land and shops to the Berkeley County Roundhouse Commission, where it now sits, proudly, awaiting a reinvigorated reinvention of itself.